So I'm going to give a broad overview of food and its environmental and human health impacts, some of which has already been covered so far this morning, particularly by Andy, but repetition does no harm. And then I'm going to focus specifically on the link between environmental impacts and diets, and argue why we need to focus on consumption. Then I'm going to talk a bit about what we know, what we don't know about the concept of sustainable healthy diets, and end with some questions and challenges, and a little bit about the Food Climate Research Network, since Kate did highlight the need for effective communication and sort of brokering and engagement with different perspectives, and that's very much what the FCRN is trying to do. So this is why I find food really interesting, because it's a bit about everything. It links us very clearly with the Earth. It's the bit of the planet that we take into our mouths, and it links up with a whole suite of planetary issues. It's very closely connected with our health and our well-being. But I think how we grow food, what we think good food is, how we treat our animals, all these speak so much about who we are as human beings. And if we don't actually think about where we want to go and who we want to be, we will not collectively come together to address some of the other problems that we face. So I'm going to sort of talk briefly about all these in turn. And I think, we hear a lot about climate change, but the thing for me that is most fundamental is land. 50% of the Earth's surface is basically taken over to human activities. And the connection with food is that the vast majority of that is to grow the food and to rear the animals that we eat. And the more you clear land for human purposes, the less there is of this, of biodiversity. And this slide very clearly shows that there's always going to be some kind of baseline extinction rate, because species just fall out of surviving, really. But since in the recent past, you can see there's been a 100-fold increase in the rate of extinctions, and if we carry on as we're doing, it's just going to go off the roof. So biodiversity loss, by clearing land and putting it over to human purposes, we are contributing to the destruction of other species on Earth, and Kate has already shown that with her planetary boundaries slide, that the biodiversity one is the one that's really in the most parlous state. And you already showed the problem of overfishing. So, a third of species are overfished, and this bit is not a good news story. We're at kind of breakpoint capacity here. So we've also got the problem of sort of homogenization of food supplies, and you think, how can that possibly be? You go to Tesco's and you see any number of fruit and vegetables and delicious things to eat, but within species there has been a dwindling in the diversity within species and within varieties. So we're eating more of a variety of foods, but that variety is also somewhat illusory, because we, out of all the potentially edible species that we could be eating, some of them won't be very nice, but they will be edible, we rely largely on just a handful of species, and that of course exposes us to diseases and vagaries of climate change and so on and so forth. So again, Andy's touched on water. The point here is that to produce food we use water, and most of the water we use worldwide is to produce food. And the projections are that our need for everything else, industrial activity, urbanisation, swimming pools, more resource, more water-hungry consumption patterns is projected to increase. And therefore, but at the same time, our demand for food is going to increase. But the amount of water available for food consumption, for food production, is going to be squeezed by all the other pressures we have on our water supplies. So that too is a problem, and you can see that water stress is projected to increase. And then there's the matter of climate change. So we hear about carbon dioxide and fossil fuels, and of course that accounts for the majority of the climate change impacts that we're seeing worldwide. But about a third, 30%-ish, of global climate change emissions are attributable to the way we produce and distribute food. And most of those impacts arise at the farming stage, within direct emissions, so methane and nitrous oxide, largely arising from the rearing of animals, particularly methane, but also nitrous oxide in their manure and their urine, and indirectly because they're eating feed crops which may be fertilised. And of course land use change, because by cutting down trees and by ploughing up pastures, you're leading to the release of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, which once it's gone, it's gone. And then further down the supply chain, it all gets a bit simpler, and you're mainly dealing with fossil fuels and the CO2 that arises from that. So if we don't tackle food, we will not meet our global climate targets. So this is really, to my mind, the scariest slide of all, because this shows our annual emissions, and 30% of those are food related. These are all the allowable emissions if we're going to be going to hit our 2-degree target. We're not going to breach that. So we have to somehow squeeze all our emissions, from heating, lighting this room, flying on holiday, doing everything that we do in our society, into the space currently occupied by emissions from food. And if we're going to meet the 1.5-degree target, which gives small island states a chance of not going under, we're going to have to do something totally miraculous, which will probably involve negative emissions, which will probably involve using land to suck carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, which will mean less space available for food, for biodiversity, and so on and so forth, which will mean some very big and serious choices that we'll have to face. And of course, there's the flip side of the coin, which Andy's already pointed out. That comes in a minute. But just the point here is that although we're getting to grips with deforestation, inadequately but slowly, the emissions from land clearance are beginning to halt. Direct emissions from agriculture are still increasing, and that really is because of the rising production and consumption of animal products, so of all kinds, pigs, poultry, ruminants, and so forth. And this is the bit where I'm just pointing out that, you know, the yields are projected to decline. Maybe not decline, but the rate of increase is going to slow, and we need to be keeping those yield increases going if we are going to meet population demands. Needs, demands, a big question. And as Andy's already pointed out, the nutritional content of those major staple crops upon which we rely is also projected to decline, and for populations who depend, whose diets are largely starch or tuber or grain based, they're not getting the micronutrients they need as it stands. And if the quality of what the staples that they are eating declines further, then so will the severity of the problems will increase. And of course, there's going to be knock-on effects, food safety concerns, you know, rising temperatures in combination with inadequate storage creates a big problem, or refrigeration demands will increase, which means energy demands will increase. So you're solving one problem and exacerbating another. And again, Andy's already pointed out, food losses and waste. In principle, if we didn't produce that food, it would either go to feed people, or we wouldn't need to produce it in the first place, which would place less pressure on land, a bit fewer greenhouse gas emissions, and so on and so forth. And you can see that the causes of food losses and waste differ in different parts of the world. In a country where food is less than 10% of household spending, we waste food because we just don't get around to eating it. In a country where transport infrastructure, storage infrastructure, diseases and so on and so forth is so great, food gets spoiled or lost or eaten by rodents. So the causes are going to be different and we require different solutions. So that kind of brings us to health, and I've been asked to talk about food and diet, but it's already manifestly clear from the discussion so far is that food and health are connected in multiple different ways. So you've got the food security and nutrition side of things, which is the obvious one. You've got the whole environmental health risks, which relate to land use and how climate change alters, which is induced by and affected by food system, how the pathways there, which I think we're going to hear about a bit more this afternoon, zoonotic diseases, food safety problems, heat stress for agricultural workers, and so on and so forth. Again, they've been touched upon. And then you've got health and equity impacts insofar as agricultural labour, inequalities in the food service sector, the whole value chain is a manifestation of the inequalities that exacerbate and perpetuate poor health outcomes. So, food, health, multiply connected. And diet. So we already heard somebody mention the rise in obesity, and we have this kind of weird situation where you get 800 million people who don't get enough to eat, and yet 2 billion of us are overweight or obese. Roughly equal numbers of children are underweight and overweight, and within families you get families that suffer simultaneously from undernutrition, overconsumption, and micronutrient deficiencies. And poor diet is now, which to an extent is a good news story. As we get older, we don't die of something, we're dying of this. So it really does depend, as Kate says, what story you tell, which picture you present. But what is incontrovertible is the fact that we're eating more things and we're eating more high-impact food that has a higher environmental footprint. And so this was a study by the ODI done a while back, which shows that, over the last, 50 years, here are some selection of countries, people are eating more food, that's good, but they're also eating more animal products, which arguably may be good in some contexts, but the impacts of all that leads to rising environmental pressures. But that simple story, and that's the problem, we can't tell these big macro aggregate stories, because at the same time you've got the fact that, in Britain and the United States we spend so little on our food, so arguably we should be spending more on food. All those environmental externalities, which, it's a misnomer, they are environmental realities, the price of food should reflect that, but at the same time, if you spend too much on food, you're not having money to spend on anything else that you need to do to have a flourishing life. So we need to get a fair price for food, and no one's really figured out what that is yet. So what can we do? 3 things, and they're all essential and interconnected. We need to produce differently, and I'm not going to talk about that here. We need to make things fairer, which is about redistribution, getting prices right, getting production and consumption interconnected, and we need to eat differently. So the question is, what is a more sustainable diet? So there's really various ways of looking at this. One is to say, okay, so how can we eat in a way that reduces the environmental footprint of the food system? And here the answer is reasonably straightforward with a few caveats. You just eat less meat. So study after study has more or less shown that if you cut down on the animal component of the diet, you're going to reduce land use requirements, greenhouse gas emissions, and sometimes water use. But there is another way of looking at it, which is if we eat more healthily, will that also deliver a lower environmental impact? And here the evidence is a little bit more ambivalent because, firstly it depends who's recommending which diet. So these are the Dutch, and the Dutch are recommending certain dietary guidelines. And what you find is that if you eat according to the Dutch dietary guidelines, you're going to cut your carbon footprint a little bit compared to what you're currently doing. And if you eat a more or less nutritionally balanced diet according to their guidelines that have fewer animal products, you get a sort of win-win happening. But they can also increase. So if you follow the US dietary guidelines, which recommend quite large quantities of dairy products and fish, and you eat lots of fruits and vegetables that are grown in highly water-stressed regions using very energy-intensive production methods, you actually find that a diet consistent with dietary guidelines leads to increases in the environmental footprint, because, by the way, those dietary guidelines don't really recommend much by way of a reduction in meat. So those were all theoretical, idealised diets, but then you look at real-life diets. This was a French study, and it found that people who had slightly what they called higher quality diets, healthier diets, tended to have a higher carbon footprint than people who had a less healthy diet, mainly because they were eating, the meat component didn't change much. They were consuming the healthier diets, had slightly more dairy and a lot more fruit and vegetables, and fewer sugary foods. Now, obviously, the great thing about sugar is that it has a low carbon footprint, which is why we use it as a biofuel. So, but you don't really want to be eating much of it. So there are potential trade-offs, and there are risks of micronutrient deficiencies, sometimes with diets that are very low in animal products. Unless you're highly informed and careful, which you entirely can be, but that leads on to something I'll be talking about a bit in a minute, which is about how you think about idealised versus realistic diets. So, and this was the citations off the bottom, but Alan's been involved in, where is Alan? Somewhere at the back, was involved in this study, which really looked at, it was a kind of linear optimization approach, which looked at how you can wriggle around to get a diet that hit those nutritional requirements for least environmental cost. And it found that up to about 40% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, you could be nutritionally adequate, more or less culturally recognisable, and get quite a reduction. Beyond that point, the diet starts to look quite weird, and beyond the point, further still, you're getting a nutrient shortfall. So I suppose the short answer is win-wins are possible, but not inevitable. It's an arranged marriage, not a love match, and those are the kind of the general messages. And this was a study done by a colleague of mine at Oxford, which was a sort of very large-scale study, which more or less it looked at the kind of healthy diets, vegetarian diets, and vegan diets, and plotted the avoided deaths, and it plotted the change in greenhouse gas emissions, and it came to the conclusion that you get lots of health savings because people eat more fruits and vegetables and less red meat, largely, and you get a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. Now, those studies are very appealing, but I always feel really sceptical of them because they don't give you the fine grained detail. And I think, health, apart from anything else, lies in the detail of the individual and the society's, context and economic circumstances and so forth. So I think there are some big buts in our understanding of the links between diet and environmental sustainability. And first is, sustainability is often greenhouse gases are used as a proxy for sustainability. Now, climate change is really important, but there are other environmental issues that we need to consider, biodiversity, land use, water, a whole host of different issues. There are also other dimensions to sustainability, some of which are non-environmental, and of course there are other pathways that link food and health. So focus on diets at the expense of all the other links between food systems and health. You may get some trade-offs there. The second is the whole shifting diets thing. Study after study has kind of produced the perfect sustainable diet. But how on earth are we going to get there? We really need to understand what food systems, how we actually affect change. Low-income context, a lot of focus on developed countries, much less on low-income countries, although, again, Alan and his team there are looking at the whole sustainable diets issue in India, so hopefully there'll be some new research there. And then there's this problem of idealised diets, we can all eat healthily, but what will people really do in practice, and how will policy changes aimed at shifting diets lead to both intended and unintended outcomes? So
That's stuff I don't really have time to talk about, so I won't. But I think this is my final sort of slide for this, is that I think we need to engage with different ideas about progress if we're going to be starting to think about this. So you think about food and good food, and environmentalists and health groups say, oh, good food is a healthy diet, it's an environmentally sustainable diet. Not necessarily. It might be cheap, it might be good for the economy, it might be value added, it might be junk food, it might be fancy food, it might be food you eat with friends, food that gives you status. People eat for lots of different ways and reasons, and policymakers make decisions about agriculture and the food system for lots of reasons, very few of which have anything to do with health or environmental sustainability. And unless we start to think about the assumptions and the drivers that are leading to the way things are now, and what people feel is important, there is no way that we're going to have any kind of positive change, because people will bring their baggage of values with them, and we need to engage with those. So I don't really have time to talk about the Current Research Network, but this is the website. Anyone's very welcome to join, and I'll finish there.